Hi, we complete 2 Samuel 8 today as we continue, as you can see on the right side of the screen, going through the acts of David's consolidation of the legitimacy of his royal reign in 2 Samuel 5 to 10. And today we're on the end of this section here in chapter 8, where in the first video in this unit, I tried to show using the work of Baruch Halpern and others how when you read it more closely, it doesn't necessarily say what it seemed like it's saying, that the extent of David's victories in war is really not nearly as much as a casual reader would think. In the second part, up until the section we're on today, I noticed some of the ironies in there, that there's an anti-monarchical element hidden within right at the moment of David's peak of power. So as I've been saying throughout, these authors have multiple voices, not necessarily, but possibly multiple sources. The traditional understanding was that there was an anti-monarchical and a pro-monarchical source that got woven together. But perhaps there's a single author who understands that there are advantages of monarchy and disadvantages. But what we're seeing here is that the peak of David's powers, now that he's been promised an eternal reign in chapter 7, and now that he's winning all these victories and has made a name for himself, as we saw, it's right on the eve of the collapse. So as we looked at the shape of this section, we noted the parallels with 1 Samuel 24 to 26, as you see here. Now we're just on this little summary of the cabinet, which there is no parallel because Saul's monarchy was nothing like that. Saul did not have a palace as far as we know. He was just in his hometown of Gibeah. He, of course, had Abner over his army. But as far as we know, Abner was a family friend he grew up with, and we don't know any other officials in his court other than Doeg, who spontaneously was willing to murder more than 80 priests at Saul's command. So the beginning of the monarchy was just barely anything we could say that looks like a kingdom. With royal officials. But now we see the beginning of an administrative state. And so I want to compare, look at these royal lists, really just these 3 verses here, which seem like not worth the time, but there's this whole section, a lot hidden there. So I want to do it 3 ways, to compare our list here with what we see later in 2 Samuel, what we see in Solomon's list, with what these royal roles are, and understanding beyond the immediate words, secretary, for example, does not convey what's going on here, and who the actual individuals are in David's team that we'll see later, and why we see some of them a lot and others not so much. So first, let's look at the lists here, and there's really not that much to pay attention to the text itself. It just has names and roles, and so really our work's going to be on the right side of the screen here today. So this section here in 2 Samuel is after the restoration, after the putting down of Absalom's rebellion in 2 Samuel 15 to 19. And Joab, who was instrumental, as we'll see in that, remains in command of the army here. We hear about Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, as recorder, but that's and he's named here again, although we only hear him mentioned in those 2 places and hear nothing else about him, as we'll see again. Then we hear the role of priest, Zadok and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar. We'll look more closely at that in a little bit, but we notice that by the end it's Zadok and Abiathar, not Ahimelech, son of Abiathar. Is this the Abiathar who's Ahimelech's father, or another son? There's a couple generations going back and forth between the names Ahimelech and Abiathar, as we'll see. But by the time we get to Solomon, which after all isn't that much later than this, after this there's only some small events and some summaries, and then Solomon is going to be king, we see there's some continuity but also much discontinuity. We hear of another person, Azariah, son of Zadok, was the priest, so staying in the Zadok line, and yet we see that Zadok and Abiathar are both priests, as they were here. So continuity here between the reign of David and his son Solomon. And yet we see now Benaiah, who had been in charge of the Kerethites and Pelethites, which are the mercenaries. There's no actual title here for that, so I didn't put it aside as a title. But this is the mercenary troops, and then he becomes in command of the army because Joab will be dead at that point. But then what we see later in 2 Samuel are some new roles, or at least some new people in the roles. We hear Ira the Jerite was also David's priest. What's that role named separately from Zadok and Abiathar? We don't know. Just like we see here, in addition to Zadok and Ahimelech, and David's sons were priests. All of them? Some of them? Does that include Solomon and Adonijah, who will be challenging each other for the succession in the next generation in this just before this scene here? We don't know. We hear nothing else about that. But what would it even mean to call David's sons priests? We'll have to look at that when we look at the role of priests in just a minute. But what we see in Solomon is not only these roles that we've seen earlier, now we see new roles, like a supervisor here. Azariah, son of Nathan, is that the same Nathan who is the prophet? It doesn't say. Over the officials, so something like a supervisor, a chief of staff. And then Zabud, son of Nathan, again, is it the same Nathan, was priest. His father was prophet. And king's friend, that's another new role. Ahishar is in charge of the palace. We don't know exactly what that means, but that presumably includes the provisions that we see laid out in great expansive detail in 1 Kings, eating on their gold plates and all the sacrifices and such that was required to fill the king's table with all his guests. And then we see the ongoing issue that we begin to see here, but not here, the person in charge of the forced labor. And that happens in both these places here. Whether Adoram and Adoniram is the same person or not isn't 100% clear. But then we see this. Solomon had 12 officials over all Israel. Again, at this point, all Israel, including Judah, except not quite, because we're at the bottom, and there was one official in the land of Judah. So we see their names all listed here, and they're there to provide food, but also to collect taxes and provisions for that. So now we have a full administrative state over the land. And when we get to kings in our story here in our videos, I'm going to suggest that this is where the sense of the 12 tribes comes from. There was not, as we've seen throughout the story of Samuel, no sense of the Israelites as members of disparate tribes that form a nation together. I'm going to suggest that the sense of tribal identity grew out of the administrative state that divided them up into 12 pieces, and then they retrojected the story in Genesis back onto that as a post-exilic alternative understanding of their identity. But we'll get there when we get there. So that's some sense of how we see the growing establishment of an institutional monarchy. And interesting, we don't see another list like this. Perhaps that's because the whole David-Solomon succession story is an expanded narrative that, as many scholars have noted, is unusual in the entire Bible. We see a few little struggles for succession, but not many. And many of the kings don't really report they've done much. They're just king and they die and their son or somebody else succeeds them. We see a few examples, and we'll look at those as we get there. But never do we hear a formal description of the royal roles like this. So let's look more closely at what these roles are. So Abner is described as over the army, all Hatza'ava here. And I'm trying to separate out how these terms are used as royal servants and otherwise. So we saw it in our passage here. We'll see it another time here over the army. And then we see it in the parallel in Kings. But it's also the phrase when we hear Yahweh of hosts or God of hosts. The phrase of hosts, which means a heavenly army, suggests Yahweh is over the heavenly army. So while Joab may be in charge of David's army, it's Yahweh in charge of the real army, and that's always going to be a tension here. Because as I noted in the last video, the description of all of the accomplishments in chapter 8 all sound like they're David, 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 without the people, without any of these people named that I showed you in the list, and without Yahweh for that matter. It was all David. But plainly, it's not all David. No king can do all these things by himself. And we'll certainly see in chapter 11 how much he relies on Joab to get him out of the trouble he got himself into. So what's named as recorder here, mazkir, literally means one who remembers. And the verb form can simply mean the ordinary verb for remembering. As I note here, it's 41 times in the Masoretic text. I didn't note that the phrase for over the army is 39 times, but most of those are for Yahweh of hosts. So recorder is an interesting role, even though the person was named as recorder, we don't hear named again, Jehoshaphat. But it means somebody who remembers what's happened. And that's really important to have rememberings. Does that mean literally remembering, or does that mean remembering what the king wants you to remember for their own sake? And we in our culture today, whether in the United States where I am or others, know how we remember history, whether the recent past or more distant past, affects how people live today and how much they support the given government or the given cultural context and how much they feel like it's been a betrayal of what was in the past. So in the United States, for example, the argument about whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation leads many evangelicals to argue for a white nationalist Christian nation. Others who see it more as a secular origin, with God simply a little decoration on top of the Enlightenment-based arguments that the founding people were involved in, would argue otherwise. So how we remember that can affect what we think the vision is for the future, especially in a world like theirs where very few people were literate. And note that there's a secretary named here, which is also a scribe, as we see, but neither Sariah nor Jehoshaphat are ever mentioned again, as we'll see just in a moment. So whatever role they had, we don't see them actually having that role much here. There's another angle on this, and we see Elijah expressing it as a prophetic remembrance, in the sense that God will remember your sins and punish you for them. So lest you think you can get away from them, the ultimate rememberer, of course, is God. Like so many of these things, just as we saw God is over the army, and of course, God can't mediate with God's self, but in the sense of revealing or linking humans with the holy, Yahweh is, of course, the most direct expression of that. So I didn't separate out priest, the Hebrew Kohen, here because it's used 750 times in the Masoretic text. Over 150 times in the Deuteronomistic history, in Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, 41 times in 1 and 2 Samuel. So, as I note here, before the temple under Solomon and successors, the scope of their royal role is unclear. There's no official place for them to offer sacrifice. Are they doing other things? Are they praying an intercession for the king or for the people? We simply don't hear. Here it's just simply named they have these roles. And to the extent that David's sons are in those roles, and obviously we don't hear that they have any training in that or any particular call, perhaps it's ceremonial, much like in the much later, in a very different cultural context, Roman Empire, becoming a priest of one of the Roman gods was an expression of honor to someone, not a sense as we might think, especially in the Catholic context of priests, as a vocation, something you understand was given by the gods to help people in their relationship with God, but it might just be simply a public honor to have that role. And it's not clear before the temple what that role is exactly. Then we get, as I was noting, to secretary, sofer in the Hebrew, or scribe. And that's a very important role because very few people were literate. And so, certainly the king would not necessarily be literate. We have no sense that David is literate. As a shepherd boy, there's no reason to think that he would have learned the technologies of reading and writing. And so somebody has to do that. And throughout the ancient world, that was often the case. There's no reason to think that a king necessarily had the skills of reading and writing. So they would assign that to someone who did. And so we see that in the three summaries here. Then we also see it later in 2 Kings, and we also see it in Jeremiah, much of which takes place in a royal court, since Jeremiah was a prophet in a royal court as well. So he's engaging with other kings' scribes as well there. And as my note has, it served as the primary vehicle of written communication between the royal court and others. So certainly the people who actually wrote the Deuteronomistic history were scribes, and anybody who edited them had any role along the way. They were not rabbis in the later sense, although rabbis had some of that role, but this is certainly in the pre-temple destruction area. The rabbis don't come to be till much later. And in the Hebrew, rabbi means teacher. It doesn't mean scribe. Sofer is still the word for a scribe, someone nowadays whose job it is to write a Torah, which is a very sacred act. So finally here, those in charge of the forced labor, all Hamas. And I note you might recognize the term Hamas for the group that initiated the recent violence in the Middle East, and it's from the same word, meaning forced labor, or it can also simply mean violence, forced labor in the literal sense of slavery. That term is 23 times in the Masoretic text, but someone in charge of the forced labor is only 6 times, and we see it in a couple of places here in the later part of Samuel, and as I noted, under Solomon, and then later also under Solomon, and then here in the transition to Rehoboam there. So those are the nature of the different offices as they play out. How about the actual people? And similarly, some of these are important characters as we go, and some are not. Joab, we've seen briefly before, but not that much. We saw him earlier in this book. He was one of the 3 sons of Zeruiah, who turns out to be the mother, not the father, brother of Asahel and Abishai. We already saw Asahel killed in 2 Samuel 22:23 by Abishai. And then Abishai with Joab murdered Abner, who was Saul's leader. So Joab has been around in a couple of occasions of dispatching Saul's remnants to establish it under David. And also it attempted to negotiate the business with Abner before Abner ended up getting killed, when Abner came over and tried to bring the Saulites into the Davidic orbit. He also bridged the transition from Saul to David, as we've seen, and he'll also, as we'll see, participate in the Bathsheba-Uriah cover-up for David, being willing to put Uriah in the front of the fighting and not tell anybody that the king is having the husband of the woman who he's gotten pregnant killed at the front to cover up the pregnancy and the affair. He will also seek to prevent, first in 2 Samuel 14, and then to stop in the following chapters, Absalom's rebellion. And yet he's there at the end when Absalom gets his long hair caught in a tree and dispatches him. And he's also there to reestablish David's reign after David is mourning after the death of Absalom. And Joab says, "Wake up, man. The troops are thinking that their sacrifice was not worth it, since you're sad that they accomplished what you wanted them to accomplish, which is the destruction of your enemy." So Joab wakes David back up after his grieving to take control before it all slips away from him. Finally, he makes the wrong call for reasons that we'll get to and aren't exactly clear anyway, supporting Adonijah in the succession struggle, and then ends up being murdered by Benaiah at the command of Solomon, who, of course, won the succession struggle. So, Joab is a big character and mentioned 96 times. Jehoshaphat and down here Sariah are only mentioned in those places, so we don't know anything else about them. Zadok, son of Ahitub, highlights that he's a descendant of Eli, the disgraced priest whose sons were disgraced way back in the beginning of 1 Samuel in the time of Hannah and Samuel at the time, a young Samuel who was apprenticed under Eli. But Eli falls off his chair and his whole lineage seems to come to an end. And yet, it's not at an end. Here's Zadok, the son of Ahitub, who's found his way into the court of David. And he will partner with Abiathar to serve David during Absalom's rebellion. And he, unlike Abiathar, will side with Solomon in the succession struggle, and we saw his name on the list as one of the priests of Solomon. Not only that, his lineage becomes the name of the lineage of priests later. So Ezra in the book of Ezra is named as a descendant of Zadok. And then his lineage in Ezekiel become referred to as the Levitical priest in the post-exilic period. And many scholars think that that name Zadok is the root of what we see in the New Testament, the Sadducees, in which you can see the consonants Sadducee are the same transliterated consonants as we see here, the Zadokites, similarly there. That's not 100% sure, but it's the prevailing view among most scholars. So a priestly lineage that seems to last close to 1,000 years, if not longer. Then we see Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, who's the grandson of his own namesake. So there was an Ahimelech, an Abiathar, Ahimelech, and another Abiathar. And so he's the son of the Abiathar who was saved by David at Nob when Saul's representative Doeg killed all the priests there after he'd heard that David was there, and he's not mentioned again. But it's his son Abiathar who will have the role starting in 2 Samuel 15:24 in the Absalom rebellion. And as I noted, he works alongside Zadok. But he sides on the wrong side with Adonijah in the succession and is first banished but then restored by Solomon. And then finally, very interestingly, not mentioned in any of these lists is Nathan, who we only saw previously in chapter 7, and he's introduced with no prologue at all, seeming like we all know that Nathan is David's court prophet. Halpern thinks he's a fiction of the story, and that may well be. There's no way to prove that one way or another, of course. But he mediated the oracle from Yahweh about who was building whom a house. And he'll also mediate another oracle from Yahweh about how to respond to the Bathsheba-Uriah situation, making a bold challenge to the king to basically imply that the king is the murderer and adulterer that he is. Then he will side with Bathsheba in the succession struggle, convincing her to go in and convince David that he'd picked Solomon all along, and that, of course, works to his benefit, and he survives, and Bathsheba survives, and Adonijah does not. So that's a little overview of how these things work, and we won't see a list of that again. We'll turn in chapter 9 to, as I was noting, the center of our chapter, of our section here, where David, on his own, although with some help, takes control of the last surviving members of Saul's household. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.